It's great to see a robust showing today. I know a lot of folks have this week off, so good afternoon, all. I'm Penny Bishop. I'm Dean of the BU Wheelock College of Education and Human Development. Welcome to this month's edition of Conversations with the Dean. In this webinar series in general, we focus on a wide range of important topics within education. Our discussions always reflect our college's deep commitment to transforming systems, particularly those that are inequitable. Each webinar focuses on the complexity of the issue and seeks to uncover the transformational opportunities to see both students and communities thrive. I'm really excited about today's webinar. The webinars are always grounded in our GuideStar commitment, which ensures that our work is always aligned with our core values and with our systems orientation. And today's session will take a little bit of a different approach. We are broadening the discussion from individual faculty scholarship or partnership to attempt to leverage the expertise of our faculty to help us all understand the changes, and there have been many that are underway at the federal level right now, and what that may mean for students and families and resources at the heart of the United States education system. So I know that many of us anticipated dramatic and potentially threatening actions with the most recent change in administration, but at least for me personally, I hadn't anticipated the scale and the pace of the executive orders and actions that are undeniably going to reshape our government. We know that there are impacts for education broadly, and because we have limited time, we've focused today's discussion on the changes that are proposed or have begun or already begun that are explicitly directed toward the PK-12 education system. Now, by doing that, we don't mean to diminish any of the intersecting orders that also impact students and families we serve in higher education. But in 45 minutes, we thought it would be best to stay focused for an initial overview. We'll see what happens. We know we all have a lot of questions, and I'm particularly glad to be able to rely on the expertise of two of our fabulous faculty members in BU Wheelock's Education Leadership Department, and they're both uniquely qualified to speak on this topic. So Dr. Raul Fernandez is a senior lecturer in the Educational Leadership and Policy Studies here at BU. He studies, writes, and teaches about inequities in education. Raul is a BU alumnus and has served in a number of prestigious roles, previously as chair of the Racial Imbalance Advisory Council of the Mathematics Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. And he's been named a Public Impact Scholar by the Initiative on Cities. So thank you so much for being here today, Raul. Dr. ArielTichnor-Wagner is a lecturer and program director of the Educational Policy Studies program here at BU Wheelock. She's affiliated with Wheelock Educational Policy Center, or familiarly known as WEPIC. Her research focuses on educational policy and politics with an emphasis on policy and program implementation, continuous improvement research, school improvement, civics education, global citizenship education, and teacher policy. Having begun her career as a public school teacher, Dr. Tichnor-Wagner is deeply committed to research that supports educators in designing and implementing policies and practices that support the academic and social-emotional development of diverse and historically underserved students. So you can see from these bios that we have terrific folks here on today's webinar. Welcome, Ariel and Raul. I'm really looking forward to our discussion, and I'm sure our audience is as well. To our audience, it's great to have you back for those of you who are returning, and welcome to folks who may be new. To our audience, please pose any questions you may have in the Q&A box, and we will do our very best to address them. All right, so let's dig in. With so much going on at the federal level right now, I was thinking we would start at the top with a headline that hasn't happened yet, but has been discussed, which is the dissolution of the Department of Education. And I'm sure that most people who are joining us today will have heard about that and have some questions. And I thought it would be helpful, Ariel, if you might start us off by talking a little bit about what the role of the federal government is in PK-12 education. What does it do and not do? And what is it that the U.S. Department of Education does?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for hosting this conversation today and for everyone for being here on this Thursday afternoon. And a really important question. So to kind of zoom out to like the role of the federal government in general, right? Constitutionally speaking, it actually has a very minimal role in education. So for just like quick civic lessons, United States federalism divides powers between state governments and the federal government. And the 10th Amendment explicitly states that any powers not delegated explicitly in the Constitution, right, are reserved to the states. And so education is mentioned 0 times in the U.S. Constitution. So by default, right, education is right under kind of the jurisdiction of the states. Um, so that means that kind of what the federal government does not do, right, is that they don't have jurisdiction over curriculum, standards, assessments, teacher-related policies, school finance policies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? All of that is kind of under the jurisdiction of state governments. That being said, they do have a role. So the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, sorry for this constitutional lesson now, right, states that it includes the Equal Protection Clause. And that says that no state shall deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protections of the law. So this has really opened the door for federal involvement in education in a number of ways, particularly, right, as it relates to equality, access, and the protection of civil rights. But beyond kind of constitutional authority, Congress has the power of the purse, right, through grant funding, which schools, particularly K-12 schools, and also higher education institutions do see a lot of, and the power of the bully pulpit, right? So the president, who's in power, often kind of sets the political direction of their party, and also kind of states may then follow suit, right, to kind of curry favor, right, with whoever's in power. About 13% of education spending comes from the federal government. So the vast, vast majority is state funded and locally funded. But there's kind of a few ways, right, that Congress has set has kind of set grants that provide funding to states and local school districts. So we see this through the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and Title I funds that provide education funding to low-income students, the IDEA funding, which provides funding and services to special education students, the higher education level through student loans and Pell Grants. So that's Congress, right? But you asked about the Department of Education, right? So our federal government also, right, has 3 co-equal branches of government. So while Congress kind of sets policy, and while Congress has the power of the purse, it's the Department of Education that's that administrative arm of the executive branch, right? And also kind of is the one that administers these various programs, right? And the budget that Congress sets forth. At the beginning of this year, the U.S. Department of Education, right, has had a budget of just under $80 billion, focused on primary and secondary education programs. So they administer those programs, right, which I already said are the Title I grants, IDA special education grants, and then kind of higher education space, also Pell Grants. They also run the Office of Civil Rights, which oversees complaints that relates to violation of civil rights in schools, both at the K-12 level and the higher education level as well.
Ariel, that was incredibly helpful. Thank you. I know you apologized for the constitutional lesson, but I think it's just what we needed. So I appreciate that framing very much. Raul, building on that, what would it mean for the U.S. Department of Education to be shuttered? And is that even possible?
Right, right. And thanks, Dean Bishop, for having us here, and Ariel, good to be with you, and everybody. This is something that came up in the congressional hearing for the confirmation of Linda McMahon. Was this idea about whether or not Congress would have to be involved in order to completely close the Department of Education? She said yes, and others agree, and that would certainly be required, but that doesn't mean that the current administration couldn't significantly change or reduce the scope of what the Department of Education does, all the things that Ariel just laid out. We're thinking really about the idea around funding, and sort of some of the ostensibly the idea is to return education to the states, and some of the idea here that the carrot would be that more funding that's spent at the federal level would return to the state level. And there's lots of folks that wouldn't be too upset about that, putting more local control, at least statewide control over education. But the stick here really is around enforcement. Enforcement, as we've seen, and we can talk about the Dear Colleague letter that recently came out through the Office of Civil Rights and the Department of Education, is that funding will flow if, and that if is really important. And there's certainly at least an attempt, as indicated in that letter, as indicated in previous executive orders, to say funding will flow if you agree that gender is grounded in a binary. If you agree to not have any programs based on race explicitly or implicitly, whether it's college campuses or in K-12, if you agree to this worldview, then funding will flow. And I think that's one of the major concerns is if institutions largely don't agree to comply with those right now what's been expressed to these orders in this letter, but ultimately will attempt to be proper efforts toward compliance. If they don't agree whether or not that funding will flow, and that if it doesn't, that could have dramatic impacts for everything that we do in education. Certainly, we've already seen some of that happening with the executive order around restricting access to grants in higher ed, certainly, and in K-12 as well. I will say that in some ways, the federal government, or more broadly, Department of Education specifically, doesn't necessarily have to require that districts do these things. Only, and in what we've seen so far, is mostly bluster and pseudo-legal reinterpretation of existing laws, can actually get districts to comply in states that are broadly supportive of DEI, for instance, and other related policies, just by kind of making these threats. And so I think the things we have to keep an eye on is that there'll be a long drawn out court cases around many of these attempts to reshape the Department of Education. Certainly Congress will become involved in these attempts as well. But at the same time, districts themselves, colleges themselves, could decide to comply even without any of that actually becoming law. And in those ways, there is potential for impacts on everyone everywhere. And it's something we should certainly keep an eye on. And I know that we are at BU Wheelock.
Thanks, Raul. So if it were to be shuttered, then what would that dissolution mean for states and districts and schools? Like, in what ways might they feel the difference without that department hanging together the way it does?
Yeah, I'll just say a couple more words and leave some space for Ariel to share as well. One of the pieces here is that in order to enforce civil rights law, at least as we knew it, it requires a bit of a bureaucracy. And one of the attempts here, not just in education, but more broadly at the federal administrative level, is to reduce the size of bureaucracy. And so there are any number of complaints that are lodged with the Office of Civil Rights that even a fully staffed office, there are complaints that would take well over a year to be taken up, to be heard, and for a determination to be made. It's hard to imagine for students, for families that are lodging complaints about lack of compliance related to special needs, lack of compliance related to civil rights. That the bureaucracy is going to be there to actually hear those concerns and to make a determination and to force compliance at the local level. That's just one example of what might be lost, particularly with the reduction in the workforce within the Department of Education.
Thank
Ariel,
you.
anything else?
Yeah, and I think, it's important to note that, and kind of I'm using like Project 2025 as a guide here, because that kind of is, I think, a lot of ways that's the blueprint for a lot of the policies and executive orders, I should say, that kind of we've been seeing coming out of the White House. Right, they're proposing a mix of both kind of slashing programs entirely, but then moving programs right into other departments. So just like echoing exactly what Raul said, right, if new departments are suddenly administering programs, there's definitely going to be a backlog if anyone's ever worked in administration, right? And you're kind of moving things around, right? So you kind of have to learn about that program. There's new systems that have to be put in place. So kind of at a minimum, right, we'll see a lot of backlog. loss of resources. And then I think it's just important to state, right, there's a loss of jobs, right? So people are losing their jobs right now. And so that I think that's something else that folks are going to be feeling, right? The effect of both like, federal civil servants that are in the Washington, D.C. area, but also all the different kind of, civil servants that work for the federal government that live in local communities right around the country.
That's really helpful in grounding it in the realities of lived experience. I appreciate that. Speaking of which, a participant, George, it's nice to see you out there or to hear that you're out there. George is asking about Title I funding. He said it's so expansive and important in pre-K-12. Do you have any early sense on potential changes here? That would be to either one of you.
Yeah, so I mean, again, constitutionally, right, kind of Title I funding, right, is passed through the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, right, which has been around since 1965. Sorry, I don't want to give a history lesson now, but since 1965, right? So that's kind of an act of Congress, right, that continues, right, to be passed and upheld in a very bipartisan manner, right? So this is kind of something, Title I funds is something that Republicans and Democrats have all gotten behind, right? Because it ultimately supports, every single local school district, right, around the country. So my sense is it would actually take an act of Congress, right, to change that funding. And again, like in terms of like kind of sticks and carrots, right, it also is an act of Congress, to say, you can get this funding, say, contingent upon, making sure that your state has high quality standardized assessments and high quality standards, right? That was kind of the No Child Left Behind Act. But again, right, that was an act of Congress. What we're seeing coming out of the White House and through these executive orders, right, are these threats that if you don't comply with these, with these DEI or anti-DEI, I should say, kind of, executive orders, then federal funding could be lost. But I right now can't speak to like what those mechanisms would be, since I think kind of the wording is very vague.
Thank you, Ariel. Let's talk for a minute about the proposed Secretary of Education, Linda McMahon. Raul, you mentioned her earlier. What policies would you expect her to pursue if the department actually remains intact? What might we imagine forward?
Yeah. And I'll say that we know very little about WWE superstar Linda McMahon's thoughts on education. She has a scant record that includes having been appointed to the Board of Education in Connecticut, sat on a board of a college in Connecticut as well, but otherwise hasn't made many public pronouncements before her confirmation hearing about her thoughts on education, save for a tweet around school choice. I think it's likely, and I think we heard her say this essentially during her confirmation hearing. I watched it, so you don't have to. That she is really going to, take on the president's agenda around this, which is broadly described as reducing, if not eliminating, the Department of Education and their scope and impact. Sending more power to local districts or the states, and funding for the privatization of education, whether that be through federal dollars going to private schools, and including potentially religiously affiliated schools, as well as voucher programs as well. And that appears to be the agenda. At the same time, there's a bit of a tension here because there is an attempt, as I mentioned earlier, to enforce this worldview, a worldview around DEI, around gender, and you also need to maintain some structure to be able to enforce those policies. And it's why I think it's more likely that that some aspects, like the Office of Civil Rights, continue to exist. Although, Secretary or the nominee Linda McMahon for EdSec indicated that potentially some of these pieces could live elsewhere. OCR could live under the Department of Justice. She mentioned potentially that issues related to disabilities and special needs could live within Health and Human Services, which is headed by RFK Jr. now. And so some offloading of parts of the Department of Education to other other units within the federal administration, and then, maintaining some pieces to enact the agenda, as I mentioned. That's as far as we know right now. What I do think is fairly remarkable is that so much has been done. The cutting of IES funding, Institute for Educational Sciences, already we've seen reduction in force at the Department of Education and other moves. And there hasn't even been an education secretary confirmed yet, which we thought might happen today or should happen very soon. But so much has already happened. She also mentioned willing engagement with the Doge group, that's the so-called Department of Government Efficiency, and taking their lead in many ways in terms of how to reduce the size of the Ed Department.
Thank you, Raul. We're starting to get a lot of questions popping in. Before I turn over to those, I just want to say to Ariel, what seems similar and what seems new about those ideas that we might imagine Linda McMahon pursuing?
Yeah, so I mean, closing the Department of Education, right, has actually been like a Republican talking point since the Department of Education was founded in 1979, right? It was kind of one of Ronald Reagan's main kind of talking points and what he hoped to do, right, in the 1980s and didn't. So I think that like talking point is not new, but I think this swift action is, right? And kind of we're already seeing kind of the reduction in federal civil servants who are working there in somewhat, it seems like in indiscriminate ways, as well. And I think what seems new as well is I think just kind of again like that speed, but also kind of the people who are now kind of behind it as well. Kind of we're seeing a lot of kind of lock and step, right, with the president from his party. When it comes to school choice, again, like longstanding contentious issue. Charter schools and voucher programs, right, are not new. Betsy DeVos, who was the former Secretary of Education in Trump's first administration, was a long-standing supporter of school choice and particularly vouchers. But and even things like parents' rights, right, that we're hearing a lot of, like that even like kind of harkens back to the days of desegregation. So kind of seeing that again, that doesn't seem as new. And even things like, like these anti-DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, right, policies. We've been seeing those in states around the country, right? So since 2020, right, these anti-CRT, critical race theory, right, policies have been passed in states across the country. So if you're in Oklahoma, if you're in Florida, if you're in Idaho, if you're in North Carolina, right, this language isn't necessarily new, but now we're seeing it kind of at the federal level. So kind of, as I said before, there has historically been a lot of bipartisan consensus, I think, around education at the federal level. And now we're kind of seeing like the culture wars coming in, and almost like I dare say like the weaponization of education. So kind of a lot of language that talks about kind of radical indoctrination, right? Like the name of one of the executive orders is ending radical indoctrination in K-12 schools. So kind of that type of language, right, seems very new. So yeah, so kind of, some old trends, but some things that have kind of been percolating at the state level that we're kind of now seeing at the federal level.
Yeah, I appreciate your mentioning that some of these things aren't new for certain states. That's really important to keep in mind. I think I'm actually at the a national conference for deans of education, and I've been hearing from my colleagues from other institutions in other states very much so, here's what our experience has been over the past few years, and these things are not new. So I think it is an important reminder that there is a wide range of status out there in terms of experience with this. Yeah.
If I can add there too, is the absolute agreement here. I think the newness of it. I remember just before the inauguration watching a webinar that the Brookings Institution did, and there were 3 former education secretaries on there representing both major political parties, and they were in agreement that political gravity would take hold, and folks say these things all the time. Reagan, remember, past presidential candidates saying that they would do this when they were running for office, but no one actually did it or really intends to do it. It's a thing you say to win political points. Here we have a real meaningful effort to actually do so, and I think that's the biggest difference here. Whether or not Congress will allow it, whether or not the courts will allow certain aspects of this to happen, whether or not there'll be a resistance by educational institutions. We've seen some evidence of that already. Still, I think remains to be seen, but this is, the first truly meaningful effort in memory to actually get it done. And it does not seem like this is just about politics, but about actually, delivering on a promise that was made, just in a way that we haven't seen recently.
Mm-hmm. Thank you both. I want to just mention something that an attendee has commented that I think is it's not a question, but it's worth our remembering, and that is that many nonprofit organizations, particularly cultural arts organizations, receive DOE funding to support programming, and often those are programs that provide arts engagement to individuals who might not necessarily have access, and so I think that some of these concerns are shared in more informal education spaces. It's not just about schools. And so I appreciate that reminder. So thank you to that attendee. There are some specific questions out here about how the current climate might and actions might affect students with disabilities, and also implications for Head Start. Are either of you in a position to comment on either of those things?
I mean, I will say, and again, so much right now is so unknown, right? So, right now there have been federal freezes and federal cuts. There's also litigation right now, right? Kind of actively, saying that it's not constitutional, right? For these executive actions and freezes to take place. So there's a lot of limbo and uncertainty. I think if federal funds are to be cut, like and I think this is across the board, right? So I really appreciate the comment around kind of like nonprofit spaces and informal education spaces, early childhood education, K-12 education, higher education. I think it's important to take stock of kind of like what those funds are for. Often they're for educators, they're for extra support staff, they're for, specialized services. So, if fundings were to be cut, like we could see reductions in all of those things, right? Which kind of again lead to less resources. And I always said like the federal government only contributes, a small percentage, right, of funding to K-12 schools and higher education institutions, but we're still talking like billions and billions of dollars, right? And again, these are like for students, right? These are like supports that students will no longer get, teachers will no longer have. Think about larger class sizes. And again, think about people who aren't going to be employed. So, again, we don't know, right, what's going to happen. But we could even see, I think, a Head Start like reductions in centers. But again, I'm saying this with a grain of salt because we don't know what will happen. And I think, again, a lot of this, could be in limbo. And it's also important if you're concerned, right, about these cuts, I'll just say to kind of, find your local like congressperson, your senators, right, and tell them, right, about what you're worried about and what's at stake. If you're concerned that a program that you're involved in, that maybe a family member or friend is involved in, could potentially be on the chopping block, because Congress does have the authority, right, to pass, right, legislation to get these funds through.
Yeah, I would add to that. Yeah, the following the budget process right now at the federal level is just really important. And programs like Head Start, for instance, have some bipartisan support. And so where there might be some other issues where, depending where you're living right now, you would say, well, I'm not going to call my congressperson to support DEI programs because I know they're already not, they might not be in support of those kinds of programs, or maybe you've heard them say something like that. Something like Head Start, that might be a place where you can reach out to your member of Congress or your senator and say, hey, these are critically important programs for kids of all backgrounds, and I want you to get out there and support it. There's a slim enough Republican majority there that some haggling over this budget is going to need to happen, and fighting for programs that matter to you and the people you care about is still something you should do. I know there's a sense that maybe just a lack of control, like what can we even do? The train is moving down the track, and it's really difficult to slow it down. But I think there are some ways, particularly through this budget process, to try to ensure support for these kinds of programs.
Thanks. It is easy to feel that way, and I appreciate your naming it, Raul, because I have a feeling that there are a lot of folks feeling that way right now. I want to shift slightly here because we have a question regarding higher ed that I think is akin to what you were describing earlier in terms of the directive regarding eliminating diversity initiatives. This question asks about how easy or difficult that might be on the higher ed level, that eliminating, that there's an ultimatum given regarding eliminating diversity initiatives or risking losing federal funding. What's your take on how easy or difficult that would be on the higher ed level?
Yeah, I'll just say I think very difficult. And the power here for higher ed institutions is to work in collaboration with one another. This is you know, it's so deeply embedded into to the strategic plans, the mission, the way that that we do education, that it is difficult to imagine at least most colleges simply rolling over and just saying, okay, we're just going to completely abandon the equity agenda that's just become so much of a part of higher education without at least hearing it from the courts. And so these are, as has been said before, I mean, some of these executive orders and attempts have just been really vaguely worded, and we've heard that in the courts already, that judges, I don't know what this means. What is this? What does DEI even mean? You haven't really defined it. If you're attempting to prevent institutions from engaging in these kinds of programs, you have to be very specific about what those look like. And they haven't done that really in a meaningful way yet. And so I think this is going to take quite some time to suss out in the courts. And again, working in collaboration, no institution here has to do it alone. There number of Penny's at one of these conferences right now, where there's a lot of education deans coming together, I'm sure, thinking about how to respond to some of these challenges. I think that is the thing that is most going to slow down these attempts and work to resist them. That and the idea that there some of the writing here in these orders has been really pseudo-legalistic. I mean, it's not even attempting to adhere to the spirit of existing law. That's going to slow down what it is that they're even attempting to do. I think they'll have another bite at the apple. I think they'll work to create new orders that are much more particular and specific. And those will be orders that we have to more meaningfully contend with. But I think there is a path here toward maintaining largely what institutions have done, which is broadly trying to provide access to those with the least access to higher education, to make sure that folks feel included and affirmed in their identity, whatever that is, when they come to campus. And particularly this question, I think, is going to be a real essential one more broadly, but especially in education, is around gender identity and the attempt to define gender as a binary, when at so many of our institutions, ours included, we believe in an expansive view of gender identity as expressed in the centers that we have on campus, expressed in the way that we allow students to identify their gender when they're applying and also signing up for various things on campus. That's kind of part of who we are right now. It's hard to imagine institutions rolling over so easily on that.
Mm. Ariel, anything to add onto that?
Yeah, I think I'll just, add on just, the kind of the importance of thinking about like the legality, right? And the kind of the constitutionality of what's going on. And to, again, kind of part of, I think that the strategy of this administration, right, has been the flooding the zone, and there's so much happening all at once, and where do you even look and what do you do? So to take that step back, to read, right, kind of the actual executive orders and who they apply to and what they're actually asking, right, is a really important thing to do, to see, okay, is there legal merit to this? Are there ways that we can kind of, challenge, right, anything that, again, seems to go against values, and importantly seems to go against, kind of academic freedom and state versus, federal kind of rights, so over education. So I think it's important to like pause and take deep breaths right before kind of taking like rash action and thinking about kind of like anticipatory obedience without actually seeing like what these policies are asking folks to do.
Thanks. At least one of our attendees is a student who's interested in working in educational policy in the future and is wondering what you'd say are some other ways to get involved if the Department of Education were to shut down.
Yeah, so I'll start by saying I could take this to start because I teach in an education policy program. First, right, the Department of Education is one, right, department focused on education. There are plenty of ways to get involved at the state level. There's plenty of ways to get involved at the local level. Cities, towns, school districts, right, all play a very important role in policy. There's advocacy organizations, right, that you can get involved with. So while kind of if we're seeing a lot of cuts at the Department of Education, it doesn't mean that there aren't other spaces, right, who or where you can make an important difference.
Thank you. Relatedly, in terms of thinking about support, we have a great question from a participant asking, in what ways might teacher educators support our co-educators, for example, supervising practitioners during these fraught times? I know you're both connected to schools, and what would you say to that?
I can start. First, I just say kind of, listen to one another, form community. I think I keep saying this a lot, just like to find ways to kind of be in community with one another. Ask people, how are you doing? How are you feeling? What's going on? And just to kind of have conversations, right? So people know that kind of they're not alone in this, that there's space for people to kind of voice their concerns or challenges. I think also along those lines, like, making sure that like teachers or educators are maybe involved in and in professional organizations, right? Where I think kind of, that kind of collective action and support, is taking place right now, right? In various ways. But I think just like the simple act, right, of checking in can go a really long way and kind of keeping, right, those points of connection going.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think especially in moments like this where it seems like we're all being affected, which it feels like we are all being affected by what's happening at the federal level right now, it's important to understand as well that that there are those amongst us for whom these policy decisions are more existential. It doesn't mean that if we're not directly personally impacted by policy around immigration or around gender identity or around DEI, whatever that means to the federal government now, that that we don't care deeply about those issues, that we don't care about our students that are impacted by those issues or family members that are impacted by those issues. But it is a different thing for those of us, including folks who might be our fellow teachers, educators, staff, work alongside us. For them to be feel like this is an existential threat in some cases to their very identity, which is I know we've had some discussions about that here at BU Wheelock and our community members that feel like some of these orders are an affront to their very humanity. And so exactly what Ariel said, making that space for one another, being in community with one another, and affirming each other. When I imagine what it means to have the federal government to say you don't exist or you shouldn't be here. And folks are reckoning with that every day. My alerts don't stop, and so every day there's something new where your government is telling you you don't belong here or you don't exist. And so anything we can do to come together to push back against that, but also be in community, as Ariel said, I think is so important.
Given the framing that you mentioned earlier around this idea that our narrative that federal government should stay out of it and more decisions should be left to the states, whether it's constitutionally or otherwise, if this is the case, it means involvement at the local level will become increasingly important and impactful. What are some of the ways that you're thinking about trying to steady the experience for students? We have a question in the chat from a sophomore here at BU who's wondering how the everyday landscape will change for all students, and just thinking about if you could comment on that or the ways that you're thinking about trying to steady student experience and engage locally?
I mean, most of my classes, we start at the very first 20 minutes saying what's going on in the world as it relates to the topic of this class. And they're constantly, reading before class to make sure they're up to date on what's happening. No, it's a lot of incoming now. And I think students are feeling that it's so much the flooding the zone that Ariel talked about earlier, that there's so much happening. And there's so many question marks about whether or not any of this is it going to, the questions we're asking today, is it going to impact us? If so, how, and what's next? And what I've tried to do is make as clear as I can to them. Here's what's real. Here's what's bluster. And if you want to get involved, if you think that there are threats to education as you see it, to equity, then here are some of the things that you might want to do. And as I mentioned before, reaching out to elected officials, building community with one another, supporting associations that support your view of things. And so making sure that we don't feel so helpless in this moment. I keep imagining that sort of freight train just moving and it's going. It's just important to remember that this administration is moving at a really quick pace, trying to enact their agenda as quickly as possible. But not everything works that quickly. And there are opportunities for us to both understand what it is they're trying to do, to see it for what it is, and also to push back against it if that's something that we're interested in doing. And making sure that students feel that there is some power that they have, even in this moment, not waiting to your, till after graduation or whatever it is. But even in this moment, there are things that we all can do, and sort of, making sure that we incorporate that as part of the conversation.
Thank you, Raul. Ariel, we're running out of time, and I don't want to end without having an opportunity to spotlight, I think, a bright light in this moment. You and your colleague, BU Wheelock colleague, Dr. Kayleen Stevens, are working on an evolving framework that helps people engage in difficult conversations, I believe. And I was hoping you could share a bit about that and about that work and how you're thinking about it in this context of the current environment.
Yeah, absolutely. So Dr. Stevens and I, right, we're in the process of developing this framework, really focused on how to teach civic discourse, right? Both, I think, in K-12 schools, but I think there's a lot of application for higher education as well, right? And really the goal, right, is to help students, right, use conversations as a vehicle both for understanding one another, and to also take informed civic action that takes into account multiple perspectives and lived experiences on any kind of given issue. And we developed this framework because we know how hard it is, right, to engage in civic discourse, like on any given day, right? And it seems really harder right now in the moment, like as we're especially, I think there's this idea of like a chilling effect, people nervous, right, to speak and share. So I think one, it's just so important to continue, right, to engage, right, in discourse, right, with other people. And I think, this webinar is actually, I think, a really great example, right, of engaging in civic discourse, to hear different perspectives, right, on what's going on, whether or not you agree or not, right, with what Raul and I are saying, to be able to just listen, right, and say, okay, here's how someone's, thinking about these issues right now. Maybe I agree, maybe I don't. But what else is really important too is that often I think we think of civic discourse as being like talking to someone that's on the other side of the aisle, right? Or someone that's like kind of diametrically opposed. But it's not just that, right? It's also just kind of continuing to engage with people who you think maybe, have the same end goal or North Star, right? But there's a lot of nuances within that, right? And so instead of kind of having assumptions, right, about what people might be thinking or feeling, to continuously engage in self-reflection and also in conversation with one another is just really important, right? Especially when we think about more informed and potentially kind of successful, collective actions.
Thank you. Thanks for telling us a little bit about that. And it seems to me we need so much more of that. So I really am really so pleased that you're working on that and excited to see what comes next out of that project. I want to also recognize that while we're running out of time, there are still several really good questions that we didn't get to, and apologize to the folks who have put some questions in there, and also encourage you to reach out to us. You can find us all on the BU Wheelock website, and we would welcome your questions on email if that works for you as well. So if you didn't get your questions answered, feel free to reach out. In the meantime, I want to thank you, Raul and Ariel, so much for spending your time with us and really helping us to understand the current context. I'm sure that things will continue to evolve, but I appreciate the much needed clarity that you've offered us. I'd like to thank the audience for your participation. If you'd like to learn more about the work we do here at BU Wheelock and in the policy space, one resource in particular you could check out is our Wheelock Educational Policy Center website, and you can see some resources on the screen right now. And we also want to let you know about some exciting events. Those of you who are really interested in this particular topic, you'll be happy to know that Ariel and Raul are running a series of events as part of a listen and learn series, where they'll be diving into the evolving landscape of federal education policy. And their first event is February 26th. That's really coming up 6 days from now. And you'll see on your screen some details and a QR code to register. So if you were interested in this and want to keep learning about it, they've put up together a terrific panel. I hope to see you all at our next Conversations with the Dean webinar, where we'll talk more about anti-racist teaching with Christina Dobbs and Tina Durand. We'll be talking about their recent books. Tina's Making the Case for Race in Middle School, Supporting Adolescents and Teachers in Critical Racial Consciousness and Advocacy. And Christina's book is Preparing Anti-Racist Teachers, Fostering Anti-Bias and Equity in Teacher Preparation. Lots to learn there, and they're terrific and experienced scholars. And finally, we really hope you'll be able to join us in person for our annual BU Wheelock Forum on March 27th and 28th. The focus is thriving in the middle school years, and we'll explore this challenging but really rich and wonderful period in human development, early adolescence. And that's a passion for me and the focus of my own research. And so I'm really thrilled at the lineup we have planned. And I really invite you to join us if you can. Please scan the QR code in the corner of the slide and you'll learn more. Thank you all and have a wonderful day.